My name is Kenneth Cowens. I'm a medical doctor. I've been practicing medicine for about 30 years. My specialties are internal medicine and pediatrics. I have a special interest in lead poisoning and preventative medicine where children are concerned. Where lead has been, how it got here, how we came to the predicament that we're in with lead. Lead's been around for thousands of years. Lead has been synonymous with industrialization and modernization of any given society. It started with the Romans. They used it for building their aqueducts. They used it to sweeten wine because it made wine taste better. Renaissance Rome used lead pigments to mix the colors and make the colors brighter and make the paintings look more beautiful. In more modern times, we've used lead to make bombs, to make bullets, to make pottery, to make pewter. We've used it to make pipes. We've used it to build houses. We've used it to paint houses. And we've used it to make our gasoline more efficient. Why did we get to the place where we banned lead from our daily products and usage? Lead is a poison, pure and simple. We could not ignore the toll that it was taking on human beings with its use, with our exposure to it. We had to do something. All races, all ages, both sexes were suffering and dying from lead exposure. We used lead in gasoline because it made the cars run better and smoother. We didn't have that. The big thing in the 60s was engine knock. If you used gasoline that had lead in it, you'd stop the engine knock. The problem was that in the plants that were making the lead, what we call tetraethyl lead, people were dying. The death rates, the cancer rates, the impotence rates, the hospitalization rates, the sterility rates in women were going up. The government finally could not ignore the statistics, and they had to quietly ease away from the use of lead in gasoline and finally phase it out. The physician who I consider to be the father of sounding the alarm for lead poisoning, if you will, that was Dr. Herbert Needleman. I had the honor of hearing him lecture when I was a resident at Todd Children's Hospital here in Youngstown. And he told a story, very humbly I might add, of how it is that his research had proven the cause and effect relationship not only between lead and lead poisoning, and the lead poisoning and the damage it was doing to children's nervous systems, but also the behavioral aberrations that we were seeing in children, the juvenile delinquency rate, the inability to learn rate, the problems with school rates, the incarceration rates, the violent crime rates. All these things were correlated in their increase, their incidence and their prevalence, to an increase in lead levels. And as we identified the sources of lead and we began to eliminate them, and therefore the exposure of these children to this poison, the incidence and prevalence of these kinds of antisocial phenomena came down. His research was very much acknowledged and celebrated and emulated. However, it was not acknowledged in ways that were always becoming and honoring him. He had to go toe-to-toe with some very powerful players. Sherwin-Williams Paint Company was a major source of antagonism for him. They tried to have him incarcerated at one point, trying to prove that his research was unsound. They even paid for other investigators to do research with the specific intention that they would come out with conclusions that directly contradicted and discredited his. What comes to mind when I talk about my experiences with lead poisoning in young people is a young mother who brought her 3 boys to my practice. And they had elevated lead levels when we did their routine screenings. Now it turns out that before she had the last baby, she had moved into a rented house and the rented house was covered with lead paint. Now, while she was living in the house, the landlord scraped all the paint, that is the old paint, off the house, but the pulverized paint particles were still in the dirt where the boys were playing. So the boys were getting all this paint into their bodies, in their nails, in their mouths, in their hair, in their eyes, in their skin. So finally, when I found out that's where the lead was coming from, I had to call the landlord, and in no uncertain terms, I gave him a week before he cleaned the property out, or I would have him arrested. That probably is one of the most poignant stories I can remember. But there were many, many cases when I was in private practice here in Youngstown of children who had elevated lead levels. And it was a direct result of their exposure. Lead level elevations have occurred in adults, and we don't tend to take those as seriously as I think we should, especially in African Americans, because elevated lead levels not only affects our intelligence, it affects our cardiovascular function, it affects our kidney function. It has also been found to be culpable in later life dementia in people who've had lead exposure. And we don't take it as seriously as we should. First of all, we have to understand that the body itself mistakes lead for something that we need and use in our body. It mistakes it for calcium. Calcium is a very, very important mineral that we use in just about every single physiologic function in our bodies. In being mistaken for calcium, it goes in and it causes the enzyme systems, that is those great big protein molecules that make everything work, not to work properly. The enzymes that make your liver work, the enzymes that make that allow your blood cells to be made, the enzymes that allow your nervous system to work, the enzymes that allow your thyroid to function, the enzymes that allow you to make sperm cells, the enzymes that allow you to have a period every month and ovulate and become pregnant and then to carry a pregnancy to term. All these functions are mediated by enzymes, and all enzymes need calcium or sulfur. That's a second very important mineral. And both of these can be affected by the presence of lead. Secondly, lead can move its way from one area in the body to the other simply by sheer force of toxicity. In that respect, lead can cause direct damage to blood vessels. By causing direct damage to blood vessels, especially small ones, it creates a lot of scar tissue. In creating scar tissue in blood vessels, you create cardiovascular disease, you damage kidneys, you raise blood pressure, you create a heart that doesn't function very properly, and ultimately these two dysfunctional circumstances ongoing as time goes on can create heart failure, strokes, heart attacks, and kidney failure. What happened in Flint, in my opinion, is unspeakable. You have to understand that what I've shared with you about lead poisoning only scratches the surface of a very powerful, reliable, reproducible, credible body of knowledge that we've had for 60 years. And in this country, for that body of knowledge to be ignored to the extent that these children, these people in this city, in this continent, could be poisoned by lead in water because bureaucrats to whom these people's lives did not matter as much perhaps as their own did, made a decision that they would not do what needed to be done to clean the water, to protect the system, to remove the lead, or to prevent the lead from being dispensed in the water and therefore disseminated to the people and therefore ingested by these people, is incredible. In this country, in 2015, I am so hurt about that because this is something that didn't have to happen. The water system in the Flint River had a track record of being a polluted body of water. It not only had lead in it, it had acid in it, it had bacteria in it. What we call coliform bacteria, the kind of bacteria that give people food poisoning in third world countries and in Mexico. The General Motors plant stopped using that water supply because the acid was so strong it was eating the coating off their cars. And a decision was made that before the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, that would make that water safe from day one for people to use and to drink, were in place to go ahead and change the water supply. And even after the fact of the poisoning took place, there were lies that were told by the bureaucrats who were involved in the decision to make sure that nobody found out the truth that we were poisoning this community of people with this bad body of water. These children who have ingested this water, who have these elevated lead levels, have not only been poisoned themselves, have not only had irreparable damage to their systems, especially their nervous systems and their ability to learn and function and think and to grow intellectually, but their children have been poisoned. Their unborn children have been poisoned. Now we're talking about babies who haven't even gotten to puberty yet, but their unborn children have been poisoned. Even if you undo this now, even if you fix it, and you make sure that the water from this moment on is pure and clear and proper to drink, the damage is done. And that body of information that I just told you about that's existed for so long has proven that this is an outcome of lead poisoning. How we can do this in this country, I can't imagine. I can't imagine the level of darkness. I can't imagine the level of greed. I can't imagine the level of inhumanity that could make such an indecent decision. Is this going on in other water systems in the country? I don't know for sure. I do know that there are many houses, many more houses than we are led to believe, that are still standing and covered with layers and layers of lead-based paint, where people are moving into and living and exposing their children. And these are in major cities. I do know that to be true. Chelation is a medical therapeutic way that we address elevated lead levels. But it's very important that you understand that when you check a lead level, now this is not something that the lay population has been made aware of. When you check a lead level on a child or an adult, that lead level is a snapshot. At this moment, maybe 2 weeks before that, maybe 3 weeks before that, this is what the lead level was or is. But that lead level is not an accurate representation of the potential or actual toxicity that's taken place in the individual whose lead level you've just measured. What do you mean, Dr. Cowens? Lead stores itself in body organs. It stores itself in bone. It stores itself in brain. It stores itself in the liver. It stores itself in the kidneys. So these organs are always leaching lead into the system, and these organs are undergoing changes in themselves as a result of the abiding, ongoing, high concentration present of lead that is much, much higher than you will find in the bloodstream. So even if I do chelate somebody and I get a given lead level of 15 down to a level of 3, the lead level is going to go back up. Why? Because lead is going to be leached from the organs, especially the bones, into the bloodstream. And that tells me that the lead is still in the body doing what it does, being a poison, and I haven't gotten rid of it. First of all, in any person who is found to be lead poisoned, the first order of business, age, race, sex, whatever, is to get them away from the lead. You have got to find out if they're poisoned, where they're getting poisoned, stop the exposure right now. That is always, always the first order of business. Secondly, you have got to determine, in my opinion, what the damage the person has suffered is from the lead. Thirdly, and this especially applies to children, you need to do a nutritional assessment of the individual who has been lead poisoned. Why? Probably the largest source of release of lead into the body, into the bloodstream, going from one place to the other via the bloodstream, is the bones. And it's the largest reservoir of lead because lead is stored in the bones longer than any other organ in the body. 30 years it takes to get half the lead out of bone. Let's just say you have, a 15-year-old kid who is going through a growth spurt, which will take place maybe in the summer. If that child is not nutritionally sound, if they are not getting a well-balanced diet that is full of vitamins, proteins, and minerals, the likelihood that they're going to be lead poisoned by their own reservoir of lead in the bones is higher than if they are getting a nutritionally sound dietary regimen. If I had to give you a gut answer to the question, what is the correlation between aberrant behavior, antisocial behavior, and criminal behavior between in the inner city population and lead poisoning, I would say half, and dare somebody to prove me wrong. I've worked in the prison system. I've seen children. I've taken care of children for 20 years, 27 years. I took care of mothers who were babies and watched them to grow up and observed them go through puberty, date, become pregnant, and then take care of their children. I have seen the whole cycle come full circle. And when you look at all the variables, when you look at nutrition, when you look at genetics, when you look at asthma, when you look at smoke exposure, tobacco exposure, when you look at genetic aberrations in the family tree, lead toxicity is an abiding exposure. It is an abiding player. It is there at the beginning, it is there at the end, it is an abiding presence at the cause and effect. I believe it to be true, at least in half the cases of children who had a track record where they didn't quite learn as fast or couldn't keep up with the curve or had to repeat grades or had a reading problem or had a hearing problem and ultimately didn't do well in school and became frustrated and angry and labeled as troublemakers with poor impulse control. Half of it is lead. Examples in the prison system. I would see many males, not just African American males, but poor white males who had problems with impulse control. They weren't psychotic, but they had a history of violence. They had outside the prison and inside the prison. They couldn't sit still. They had a problem of hyperreactivity to any kind of criticism, and inability to listen to cause and effect relationships between other medical problems like high blood pressure, medication, diabetes, insulin. That is the kind of thing you see in people who have lead poisoning. I saw people who had hearing problems, but there was no history of ear infections. There was no history, there was no physical finding that showed that they had ever had head trauma or that they had ever had damage to the eardrums. I saw, in private practice, I saw many children who had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the phlegmatic response to them was to put them on Ritalin so we could make the numbers look good, we can keep them in class, and we can get them through. I believe that half of that was manifestations of lead poisoning. I had one patient. I don't know if he's still alive now. He was maybe 35. Smart, street smart, very, very devoted to a life of crime. Wanted to be a big-time gangster. Could not stand to be alone, could never sleep, and couldn't function well enough to do math. He couldn't focus long enough to do math. I wanted to check his lead levels, and he became very insulted and wouldn't let me do it. But I would go to my grave believing that the kid had damage from lead poisoning. There were some young women, some teenagers who grew up in my practice who demonstrated very aberrant, angry, hyperactive behavior that was very defiant. I had my suspicions about whether or not their lead levels were high enough at some point to have caused their behavior. The problem is we have to go back to the snapshot. If I'm doing a lead level on you and the lead level is under 10 now, that doesn't tell me what the lead level was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So the damage could have been done then. It could have been done even earlier than that. So doing lead levels now would allow me to catch somebody who was lead toxic as reflected by high lead levels in their bloodstream and refer them to the health department and possibly get them on chelation therapy and get the team to come into the house or where they're living and find out if in fact there is a source of lead poisoning. But it doesn't tell me what took place before, what insult as a result of lead poisoning could have occurred before this window of time that I'm drawing the blood. In other words, there could have been lead poisoning way back that's not taking place anymore, but the lead from way back has already done its damage. I do believe, and this is what I've learned from Flint, that people, grassroots people, have got to start taking their destinies into their own hands. There was a breach of faith and trust here between the people who were elected and selected to take care of a given group of people and the people that were under their care. I think that if a change is going to be made, the message has got to be vectored not to my colleagues, with all due respect, but to the people who are going to be affected. I think somebody needs to talk to them in terms they can understand. Somebody needs to impassion them. Somebody needs to shock them, hurt their feelings, make them angry, make them look at their children, make them think about this. And they have to hear all the things they're not hearing. That's what I believe I can do. They're not hearing that this lead poisoning poisoned the babies that are not born yet. It poisoned grandchildren that haven't even been born yet. These grandchildren, their little brains will never be all they can be. Their nervous systems will never be all they can be. They are predisposed to perform poorly in school before they're even conceived because their mothers are poisoned with lead. If you want to look at how it is that a child gets to be profiled as a juvenile delinquent, as a troublemaker, as a person who is a poor prospect to matriculate through a competitive educational system and become something that is rewarding, this is how it begins. And this was done before these children were even conceived. That is horrible. That was unspeakable. And it was done because the decision makers did not believe that these people's lives mattered as much as theirs did. And that's the lesson to the people who need to hear this message. That's what they need to hear. You're a person in Flint, you're a mother in Flint, and you're outraged about everything Dr. Cowens has said. What is it you can do? The first thing you do is make sure that you have a water filter on every faucet that runs water and that comes in contact, that delivers water, that comes in contact with you and your family. The second thing you do is find out what your children's lead levels are. The third thing you do is to get a nutritional assessment of your children. And the fourth thing you do is to make sure that they are getting the most sound, quality nutrition that you can give them, including multivitamins, every single day. You make sure that when you go to the pediatrician's office that you are in his or her face with a piece of paper, and on one side of it is questions, and on the other side is blank where you can write down your answers. You make sure that you read everything there is about your children, about nutrition, about their growth curves, and about how there can be variations in their lead levels over time as they grow and as the seasons change and as they participate or don't participate in physical activity. You learn the meanings of all the tests and the implications of all the tests that they use on your children to determine what their intellectual developmental capacity is. And finally, you pray.